Okay, let me introduce you to my high school biology teacher. His name is Mr. Puddingbottom. That's actually not his real name, but his real name is actually also kind of funny. Now, Mr. Puddingbottom was known for two things: his legendary teaching skills, he was a very good teacher, and the fact that he was an outspoken atheist. Now, Mr. Puddingbottom taught us everything from cell structures to ecosystems, but it's really in the area of evolution that he made his name known as an atheist. In fact, I remember after one classmate came up to me. She was a devout Christian, and she said that Mr. Puddingbottom's teaching on evolution really challenged her faith because, as she put it, the way he explains it, it just makes so much sense. But that begs the question, does evolution challenge the existence of God?
Ladies and gentlemen, President Putin.
It is evolving, just backward.
This is Charles Darwin. With a beard like his, you know he knows what he's talking about. Or maybe he's homeless, I don't know. Darwin is known for proposing the theory of evolution, and he's also known for being a bit shy, actually. It's funny because, being someone who hates controversies, Charles Darwin proposed one of the most controversial theories in scientific history. The theory of evolution is still stirring up controversies today. We've got popular atheists like Richard Dawkins and Daniel Dennett using the theory of evolution to try to disprove the existence of God. But we might actually be getting a bit ahead of ourselves.
Part 1. What's evolution?
You might be surprised to find that there is not a full consensus on what evolution actually entails, but there are 6 main themes in the scientific consensus. Number 1, the Earth is very, very old, about 4.5 billion years old to be exact. The process of evolution requires a very long time scale to work, so 4.5 billion years is about what's necessary to see the diversity of life that we see today. Number 2, all organic structures began as simple structures and then over many generations develop into more and more complex structures. We started with simple single-celled organisms, and over millions and millions of years, these single-celled organisms develop into more complex organisms like the ones that we see in our ecosystems today. Next is descent with modification. This one is key. It says that offsprings are just a little bit different from their parents. Think about yourself and how you kind of look like your parents, but you're a little bit different. Now, these small changes over many generations eventually add up to be very big changes. Number 4, all living organisms have a common ancestor if we trace it back far enough. So basically, we're all the products of incest. Number 5, natural selection acts on random genetic mutations to create changes in each generation. Now, if this random genetic mutation causes a characteristic that makes this organism more likely to survive in their environment, they're also more likely to reproduce and therefore pass on this trait to their next generation. And this is how, over time, these small changes accumulate to build into a more complex creature, again, reflecting the diversity of life that we see today. And lastly, all organic matter descended from non-organic matter without the intervention from God. Now, strictly speaking, this is not part of the theory of evolution per se. However, it is commonly cited alongside the theory of evolution because it tries to explain where the origin of life came from without necessarily invoking the divine. Now, despite what some militant biologists may tell you, evolution is very far from a complete science. In fact, debates about evolution and the origin of life happen in universities and research institutions all over the world every day.
Show me the prebiotic chemistry that would do this coupling. Is cherry pick this thing so it can only
I admire the tenacity with which you stick to a script of lies.
Part 2. Atheists.
This is Richard Dawkins. He might be the most famous atheist alive today. He's also a biologist and a prolific writer. He's built a career writing on evolution, biology, and more controversially, why evolution and biology indicate that God does not exist. His most famous book, The God Delusion, received raving reviews across the board, including this one from Michael Roos, who said that The God Delusion made me ashamed to be an atheist, and Dawkins would fail any introductory philosophy or religion course. But don't take my word for it, you can listen to the man yourself. Thankfully, he's known for his calm, friendly, kind demeanor to those that he disagrees with.
Mock them, ridicule them. In public.
Dawkins lays out his case against theism from evolution in his book The Blind Watchmaker. All appearances to the contrary, the only watchmaker in nature is the blind forces of physics. Natural selection, the blind, unconscious automatic process which Darwin discovered and which we now know is the explanation for the existence and apparently purposeful form of all life, has no purpose in mind. It has no mind and no mind's eye. It does not plan for the future. It has no vision, no foresight, no sight at all. If it can be said to play the role of watchmaker in nature, it is the blind watchmaker. Let's dig into Dawkins' case against theism. He uses the human eye as an example for how all complex organic structures might have come to be. First, Dawkins asks, can the human eye appear spontaneously out of nowhere, fully formed? Well, he says this is against the evidence and is frankly unrealistic. It didn't happen. However, Dawkins then suggests that maybe the human eye developed gradually over time. Maybe something came before the human eye, something that was very, very similar, but just a tiny bit more simple in structure and function. Next, he asks us to imagine a series of steps. If we trace these steps far enough back in time, we'll arrive at a creature with no eye at all. Each of these steps then incrementally develops a more and more complex structure until we eventually arrive at the human eye. Harkening back to the theory of evolution that we discussed earlier in this video, Dawkins suggests that these steps could be advanced by random genetic mutation. This is how, for Dawkins, over many generations, perhaps millions of years, a creature with no eye at all may have developed a structure that becomes more and more complex until it becomes the human eye. But lastly, Dawkins points out that each of these steps needs to provide the creature with an evolutionary adaptive advantage for their environment. In other words, the random genetic mutation that causes the change in the structure needs to give enough of a survival benefit in order to be kept. It needs to pay for itself in survival terms. So for a creature with just a light sensitive patch, that might help them hunt a bit better or avoid prey. And so over many millions of years and many generations, that eventually becomes the human eye. Now, once again, the human eye is just a stand-in for all complex organic structures. Dawkins uses the same 5 steps to explain how all of life could have come about without divine intervention. Now, if God isn't necessary, why should we bring him into the conversation at all? But here's the real question. Does Dawkins' argument actually mount a successful case against theism? No. Wait, no. Oh, I just lost all 13 of my subscribers.
Mock them.
Look, you might be a fan of Dawkins' work. I think his writing is excellent. But I have to admit his case against theism is quite weak, only because he's only successful in showing how it's possible that life came to be without God. Not that life actually came to be without God. Showing that something is possible is not the same as showing that something really did happen. Some version of Dawkins' argument is most popular, but I also think it is quite weak because it just points out that something is possible, not that it really happened. I'd still recommend reading the rest of The Blind Watchmaker. It's a lovely written book, and Dawkins does a good job at laying out the theory of evolution. But his case against theism, I don't think it really holds up that well. But that's not the same for our next guy. Next up on the chopping block is Philip Kitcher. Kitcher is a British philosopher and professor emeritus at Columbia University. He is known, among many things, for his book Living with Darwin. Living with Darwin makes a similar case as Dawkins, but Kitcher adds one element: the problem of evil. Now, the problem of evil is a millennia-long question leveled against theists, which asks, if an all-good and all-powerful God exists, then why is there so much evil and suffering in the world? For many people, this question alone is sufficient to doubt the existence of God. Now, Kitcher links the problem of evil and evolution when he writes this in Living with Darwin. Darwin's account of the history of life greatly enlarges the scale on which suffering takes place. Through millions of years, billions of animals experience vast amounts of pain, supposedly so that, after an enormous number of extinctions of entire species, on the tip of one twig of the evolutionary tree, there may emerge a species with the special properties that make us able to worship the Creator. When you consider the millions of years in which sentient creatures have suffered, the encountered number of extended and agonizing deaths, it simply rings hollow to suppose that all this is needed so that, at the very tail end of history, our species can manifest the allegedly transcendent good of free and virtuous action. Kitcher, for me, makes a very powerful point. If God exists, why did he choose to create the world in such a painful, brutal, wasteful process? We've got an unimaginable amount of suffering and evil in our biological history. All for what purpose? Just to create human beings who can worship God and do the right thing? For me, this is a much better argument against the existence of God than Dawkins's, simply because Kitcher actually gives us a reason to doubt God's existence on top of just showing that it's possible that evolution made the world that we see today. It seems very unlikely that an all-good, all-powerful God exists. But not everyone agrees with Kitcher's analysis. In particular, Christian philosopher Alvin Plantinga has two issues with Kitcher's argument. Plantinga points out that Kitcher assumes humanity is at the tail end of history. However, many theists would believe that humanity is just one part of God's plan, not the tail end of it. Second, Kitcher believes that the whole point of evolution is to create humanity. But in fact, religious texts in most theistic religions do not say that. Plantinga proposes that there may be an unknown other potential purpose that God has had in mind for evolution. Now, I'm less inclined to dismiss Kitcher's argument as Plantinga. I still think Kitcher makes a very interesting point. If God exists, why didn't he use some other method other than the very painful, suffering-filled process of evolution to create our world? However, I also have to agree with Plantinga that this moves the conversation away from evolution necessarily over to a wider conversation about suffering, evil, and the existence of God in the face of it all. I'm researching for a video on the problem of evil, so if you would like to see that, make sure you hit like, you comment, you subscribe, you shoot me in the face. Next up is Paul Draper. Draper is an American philosopher from Purdue University. In a lesser-known chapter called Evolution and the Problem of Evil, Draper lays out a similar argument to Dawkins and Kitcher against the existence of God based on evolution. Now, we've already discussed the problem of evil with Kitcher's points of view, so in this part of the video, I would just focus on Draper's work on evolution. And I gotta warn you, if you want to read his chapter for yourself, I've linked it in the description, but Draper's argument represents something unique in that he doesn't start off by assuming that evolution is true. He doesn't even try to justify that evolution is true by looking at the evidence. Instead, he's asking the question, is evolution more likely if God exists than if God doesn't exist? Effectively, Draper is comparing two scenarios here, so let's get into it. The first scenario that Draper wants to compare is evolution if God does not exist. Now, if God doesn't exist, then evolution becomes one of the only means to explain the diversity and variety of life that we see today. In other words, if God does not exist, then evolution is exactly what we'd expect to find in our world. But if we move on to scenario 2, evolution assuming that God does exist, the story changes a little bit. Because in this scenario, God exists, he could choose to create the world through another means other than evolution. More ambitiously, Draper argues that if God does exist, then it is very likely that he intervened at least once in the creation of the world when he made conscious life. Why? Because for Draper, if God exists, conscious life is fundamentally different from non-conscious life. For Draper, if God exists, minds are probably not physical. Some people might call this a soul. So Draper argues, if God does exist, then it is very likely that God made conscious life with a soul. If that is the case, then by definition, evolution would be more surprising if God exists than if God doesn't. Now Draper turns to look at the evidence for evolution. And what do you know? Evolution looks like it is probably true according to the scientific consensus. Since evolution is more surprising if God exists than if he doesn't, it is therefore rational to believe that God does not exist. What does our Christian friend Alvin Plantinga have to say about this? Well, Plantinga believes that Draper is a little bit too narrow with his analysis. Sure, if you restrict our examination to evolution alone, it might indeed be the case that evolution is less likely under God's existence. But if we look at facts on the whole, it might actually tip the scale the other way. Plantinga gives 3 examples. Number 1, the fact that life exists at all is more surprising if God does not exist. Let me explain. Most biologists and cosmologists agree that the conditions for life are very, 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 very specific. Therefore, if God does not exist, then life must have come about purely by chance. What are the odds that all of these forces coalesce by chance to create life? For Plantinga, that is quite unlikely. But if God does exist, then it is very likely that he prefers a world with life, and for that life to flourish. Therefore, the fact that life exists at all is less surprising if God exists than if he doesn't. Secondly, the fact that there is intelligent life is more surprising if God does not exist. Similar to the first case, if God does not exist, then our intelligence would have come about by evolution alone. What are the odds of that happening? At least to Plantinga, that is less likely than if God were to exist, because if God does exist, he probably prefers a world with intelligent creatures. And number 3, the fact that we have creatures with a moral compass and a desire to worship. Once again, if God does not exist, then our moral compass, and at least for some of us, our desire to worship, came about by evolution alone. How likely is that? Again, for Plantinga, that is less likely than if God does exist, because if God does exist, then he probably wants creatures to be able to do the right thing and to worship him. So, does the world fit better under Draper's philosophy, where evolution is more surprising if God exists, so therefore God probably doesn't? Or does Plantinga's explanation about the wider facts make more sense? I'll leave that for you to decide. But effectively, Alvin Plantinga's view is that all 3 perspectives that we've explored so far are not very good. I agree that Dawkins can probably do a little bit better, but Kitcher and Draper do make fairly good points. Interestingly though, Plantinga does concede that there is one area where evolution might have an edge against theism, in the area of evolutionary psychology.
Part 3. Evolutionary psychology.
Mock them.
Tigers, they have stripes. It doesn't just make them look cool, it helps them camouflage into their environment and make them better hunters. We might even say that their stripes give them an evolutionary advantage. Now, the question is, can the same be said about human psychology? That is the thesis of evolutionary psychology. In a nutshell, evolutionary psychology tries to explain what makes us uniquely human in evolutionary terms. We've got things like culture, music, art, humor, and perhaps most importantly for our discussion, our religious tendencies. Can they be explained in terms of what advantages it gave our ancestors in prehistoric environments? Evolutionary psychology first kicked off in 1975 in E.O. Wilson's Sociobiology, but its development is not without controversy. For example, Harvard psychologist Steven Pinker remarked that music was useless in terms of human evolution and development. He dismissed it as auditory cheesecake, a trivial amusement that just happens to tickle several important parts of the brain in a highly pleasurable way, as cheesecake tickles the palate. Other experts, however, disagree. For example, anthropologist Stephen Mithen argued that music could have given our ancestors an evolutionary advantage, particularly in the area of rhythm, which may help walking, marching, and coordination. But music is just one of many examples in evolutionary psychology where experts currently disagree. Examples of these abound. Think about our love for science, mathematics, art, culture, everything. Can all of these things be explained in terms of survival advantages that they gave to our ancestors? Evolutionary psychology is gaining a lot of traction in the scientific literature. For example, Wilson and Roos once wrote, "Ethics is an illusion fobbed off on us by our own genes to get us to cooperate. Thus, morality ultimately seems to be about self-interest." Wilson and Roos believe that our morality is simply a tool in our history to help our ancestors cooperate with each other and therefore better survive. Really, morality is just a remnant of our prehistory. Can the same be said about religion? Now, Wilson's theory can be broken down into 6 steps. Firstly, Wilson points out that there are some resources and goals that you cannot achieve as an individual, but you can achieve it if you work together as a group. When individuals work together as a group for the purpose of survival, Wilson calls this an adaptive unit. But secondly, Wilson points out that there are some actions that do not benefit the individual, but benefit the group. From this, he concludes that adaptive units don't just form automatically under natural selection. That's where group selection comes in. Group selection states that when individuals work together as a group, they are more likely to survive than if they were to go at it alone. Third, Wilson posits that the unique mechanism that keeps humanity working together is their moral system. If you share the same values, goals, and ideals as the person next to you, you are much more likely to work with them. Number 4, Wilson points out that a lot of morality in human history is spoken about in religious terms. Many religions make references to supernatural agents, things like God or gods, spirits, ghosts, things like that. These supernatural agents have the power to influence human lives for better or for worse. Therefore, for Wilson, religion acts as a motivator for people to stick to their moral systems. Fifth, Wilson points out that there are elements of religion that aren't necessarily helpful for survival. Therefore, Wilson believes that religion develops in a very similar way to evolution, through natural selection. Perhaps a group or community might adopt a certain religious practice or belief. If that practice or belief is helpful for survival, it'll be kept in the tradition for the next generation, and if not, it'll soon be discarded. This is a very similar trial and error process as natural selection. However, Wilson also wants to highlight that there are instances where religions do not go through trial and error, but certain beliefs and practices are implemented by religious or cultural leaders. These leaders borrow or steal a religious belief or practice from their neighbors. But even in this instance, what gets kept is still what is useful for human survival in that particular context. Now, if you're not religious, you might think that religious people represent a weakness in human psychology. That is where Wilson would push back. You see, for Wilson, religion isn't necessarily about truth. Religion is actually very connected to reality in the sense that it helps our ancestors and even us today survive and thrive in our world. Again, even if it isn't literally true, it still serves a purpose in our evolutionary process. Second, you might even know people who trade in a bit of accurate information in order to have beliefs that are comforting, helpful, or are otherwise helping them thrive in their world. The same can be said for religion in general. Perhaps our ancestors traded a bit of accurate truth in order to hold beliefs that help them get to where they are and therefore help us get to where we are today. If religion makes a certain group or individual more adaptable to their environment, even if it's not technically true, it still has a place in our society. I think Wilson's theory and others like it are very exciting, very fascinating, and perhaps even right. I will acknowledge, however, that it's somewhat disappointing that Wilson assumes that religion isn't true, or at the very least, whether religion is true or not is irrelevant. Our old friend Alvin Plantinga wants to highlight that perhaps God placed these religious impulses in us through our evolutionary history in order to draw us to him. Are you convinced by that? I'll let you decide. And now, for something you might not be expecting, our friend Alvin Plantinga wants to point out that evolution might be evidence for the existence of God. It's time for episode 5, The Theist Strikes Back.
Part 4.
Alvin Plantinga pioneered what is now known as the evolutionary argument against naturalism. For those of you that don't know, naturalism is the belief that there is no God and nothing like God. No spirits, no afterlife, nothing like that. It's just physics, biology, and chemistry. The evolutionary argument against naturalism, as proposed by Plantinga, argues that it is irrational to believe in both naturalism and evolution. Now, Plantinga takes great pains to explain that he's not saying evolution and naturalism are contradictory. They're clearly not. What he is saying is, if you're a rational person, you cannot believe in both naturalism and evolution. To understand Plantinga's argument, we need to understand the concept of our cognitive faculties. Our cognitive faculties are mental tools that help us understand the world and live in it. Examples of our cognitive faculties include our memory, our perception, and it also includes a priori intuition, which helps us understand basic mathematics, 1 + 1 = 2, and basic logic. The question that Plantinga wants us to consider is this: are our cognitive faculties generally reliable? Do our cognitive faculties generally give us an accurate representation of the world and the truth? For Plantinga, if you're a theist, you believe that God exists, the answer is very clearly yes. As Christian medieval theologian Thomas Aquinas once wrote, "Since human beings are said to be in the image of God in virtue of their having a nature that includes an intellect, such a nature is in the image of God in virtue of being most able to imitate God." But Plantinga would say that if you're a naturalist, things look very different. See, if you're a naturalist, then your cognitive faculties are the product of evolution through natural selection. Can you therefore still trust your cognitive faculties as a reliable source of truth? Well, Plantinga begins by saying that if both naturalism and evolution are true, then it is unlikely that your cognitive faculties are reliable. Secondly, Plantinga says that if someone believes in naturalism and evolution and realizes that this makes their cognitive faculties unreliable, then that gives them reasons to doubt what they believe in. If this person has reasons to doubt what they believe in, that can't just be isolated to one belief. It has to apply to all of their beliefs. In other words, if they doubt that their cognitive faculties are reliable, they have to question everything that they've ever believed in, including naturalism and evolution. Number 4, if your belief in naturalism and evolution causes you to doubt your belief in naturalism and evolution, then it is a self-defeating belief. In other words, this belief undercuts itself. What's the conclusion? Plantinga says that it is irrational to believe in both naturalism and evolution because it is a self-defeating belief. Now, there's quite a bit going on here, so let's take this one step at a time, starting with the controversial first premise. Once again, Plantinga believes that if both naturalism and evolution are true, then the odds of your cognitive faculties being reliable are quite low. It's very interesting because he is not the first person to say this. He's not even the first theist to say this. For example, atheist philosopher Thomas Nagel wrote, "If we came to believe that our capacity for objective theory, true beliefs e.g., were the product of natural selection, that would warrant serious skepticism about its results." Barry Strode, "There is an embarrassing absurdity in naturalism that is revealed as soon as the naturalist reflects and acknowledges that he believes his naturalistic theory of the world. I mean, he cannot say it and consistently regard it as true." Patricia Churchland, "Boiled down to the essentials, a nervous system enables the organism to survive in the 4 Fs: feeding, fleeing, fighting, and reproducing. The principal chore of nervous systems is to get the body parts where they should be in order that the organism may survive. Improvements in sensory motor control confer an evolutionary advantage. A fancier style of representing is advantageous so long as it is geared towards the organism's way of life and enhances the organism's chance of survival. Truth, whatever it is, definitely takes the hindmost." Okay, but these are all philosophers. I mean, who even listens to philosophers anyway? That's why no one listens to me, I guess. No, we need to hear this from a real scientist, a biologist, someone like Charles Darwin? With me, the horrid doubt always arises whether the conviction of a man's mind, which has been developed from the mind of the lower animals, are of any value or at all trustworthy. Would anyone trust in the convictions of a monkey's mind if there are any convictions in such a mind? See, if you're a naturalist, you have to believe that mental events, like basically everything else in the world, are completely physical, the products of physics, chemistry, and biology. All of your thoughts and beliefs come from neurons firing and interacting with each other. Let's say I hold a bunch of beliefs. Maybe I believe there is water to the north, or that green plants are edible, or that I'm the most good-looking guy on the planet. All of these beliefs are simply complex interactions between the neurons in my mind. According to evolutionary theory, my mind came to be the way it is because it helped my ancestors survive. Maybe I inherited a bunch of traits that helped me think in these ways. Perhaps believing that I'm the most good-looking guy on the planet helps me to hunt better. Now here's where Plantinga's first point comes in. These traits, because they help survival, are selected for. But does that mean that my neural patterns, which once again are completely physical, actually correspond to the truth? Do my neural patterns need to produce beliefs that are accurate in order for natural selection to be effective? Not according to Alvin Plantinga. See, as Plantinga understands natural selection, all that matters is that my neurons produce survival-enhancing behaviors, not true beliefs. My belief that I'm the most good-looking guy on the planet doesn't have to be true in any real or higher sense. It simply needs to help me, or my ancestors, or my offsprings survive in our environment. That means that according to Plantinga's understanding of evolution, our cognitive faculties would only apprehend the truth by pure luck. Truth is, in a very real sense, incidental. If the neural patterns that produced my belief and also my survival-enhancing behaviors happen to match accurately to the facts of the world, great. But that is by chance, not by design. I may as well believe that I'm the ugliest guy in the world or some other false belief, it doesn't matter. So long as it helps me survive, that's all that evolution cares about. Well, okay, hold on a minute. There seems to be one big error in Plantinga's argument, and that is, it seems pretty obvious that if you believe in true things, that helps you better survive in your environment. There are two gazelles. One believes that lions are predators and you should run away from them. The other believes that lions are friends and you should go towards them. Well, clearly, the gazelle that believes that the lion is a predator is more likely to survive in their environment than the gazelle who is an idiot. All this is so obvious. We are accustomed to the fact that believing in true things gives us a huge survival advantage. Can't the same be said for the evolutionary process in general? But saying that would actually miss Plantinga's point. Plantinga isn't interested in how the world actually works. He's interested in answering the question, how would the world work if naturalism and evolution are both true? Once again, if naturalism and evolution are both true, then all that happens in our heads, all of our thoughts, our beliefs, and everything are just brain states. They are neurons firing and interacting with each other. If that's the case, Plantinga believes that you cannot assume that our cognitive faculties generally produce true beliefs. Our beliefs are the result of our physical brain structures, and all that matters in the evolutionary process is that our brain structures lead us to survival-enhancing behaviors. Whether they also lead to truth or otherwise is completely irrelevant. I have to admit, I am myself a theist, but I find Plantinga's argument to be difficult, even if I find it to be well argued. It seems quite strange to me that my cognitive faculties can consistently produce false beliefs and yet still lead to survival-enhancing behaviors. In fact, that is partly how William Ramsay argues against the evolutionary argument against naturalism. In a collection of naturalist essays, Ramsay asserts that the ability to determine truth is itself survival enhancing and therefore would be selected for under natural selection. He gives an illustration. Suppose there are 10 treasure hunters. Each of them are given a different map. These treasure hunters believe that their map is accurate and therefore they will follow it. It has directions and instructions and so forth. For the purposes of understanding why these hunters do the things they do, whether their map is accurate or not is not that important. However, when we come to answering the question, why did one hunter find the treasure while the rest didn't? Well, then the accuracy of the map becomes critically important. It seems pretty plain to us that if you're given a wrong map, your chances of finding the treasure are very, very low, and if you're given the right map, your chances of finding the treasure are much higher. Well, Ramsay believes that this can apply to the evolutionary process. Creatures that consistently produce true beliefs are more likely to be successful in their environment and pass on their true believing genes to the next generation. Evolution, through natural selection, would select for cognitive faculties that regularly recognize truth. More to the point, Ramsay argues that if your cognitive faculties are consistently unreliable, that would actually harm survival. If a creature consistently misrecognizes predators as safe creatures, or consistently miss prey and therefore go hungry, well then they're not likely to survive for very long. Their genes will die out, natural selection will select them out. Ironically, the more I read Ramsay, the less convinced I am of his position. Right now, I'm actually not too sure which way I lean on the evolutionary argument against naturalism. Let me know what you think in the comments. So that's it from us today. If you like what you see and you want more, feel free to hit the subscribe button. Ponder exists to give balanced and entertaining takes on the philosophy of religion, which I think is quite sorely needed on YouTube and social media. You can find us on YouTube at Ponder Phil, or you can find us on your favorite podcasting app. Just search for Ponder, a Philosophy of Religion podcast. Until next time, signing off.